Okay, so we're almost at 3:45, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Connor. So Connor Buckley is a second-year master student, and he's advised by Professor Kerry Robinson. His interests are in fisheries management, invasive species, and ecological modeling. He holds a bachelor's degree in marine science and a bachelor's degree in biology, which he attained from University of Alabama. And the title of his talk today is going to be Projecting Sea Lamprey Barrier Passage Under Climate Change. Connor, we are ready for your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Edith, for the introduction. Like you said, my name is Connor Buckley, and I'm going to be talking about my preliminary results from my master's research. And I'd first like to thank my advisor, Kelly Robinson, and my graduate committee, Mike Jones, and Infante and Shin Young Lin, as well as a long list of those that have helped provide me with data and assisted with model review. And so if we look at sea lamprey control in the Great Lakes, we have two main tools that we think about. Firstly, chemical lampricide treatments that target larvae while they're sedentary in the stream bed, as well as barriers that block adult lamprey from accessing spawning habitat within streams. We know that these barriers are essential for sea lamprey control. They block access to habitat that would otherwise need to be treated with lampricide, or within a stream that may not be able to be treated due to high flow conditions. So this represents a huge cost savings to the sea lamprey control. And although we know that dams are largely successful, that they are not actually perfect, and although we don't have observations of sea lamprey passing over barriers, we do see evidence of it in the form of upstream larval production. And when those habitat constraints of a barrier are removed due to a barrier getting washed out or inundated by high stream flows, that sea lamprey can rapidly colonize this new habitat. And so assessing how successful barriers are is pretty important. And so we have uncertainties that might stem from a lack of understanding of certain aspects of sea lamprey ecology and how climate change might shift patterns of precipitation and stream temperature differently across the Great Lakes Basin. So the consequences of less effective barriers is critical for both minimizing the costs of sea lamprey control and for understanding where the most essential control barriers are with this pressure to remove or remediate dams due to their negative effects on migratory fish populations. So not only are we uncertain how these may impact how effective barriers are at blocking upstream habitat, but we're also uncertain as to the when and where that these uncertainties might become important. So that leads us to research questions here. Firstly, what are the factors that influence the permeability of a sea lamprey barrier? And so we hypothesized that variables relating to the climate, stream hydrology, landscape and habitat variables, physical barrier characteristics, and sea lamprey physiology and phenology are all going to be important drivers of this barrier permeability. And secondly, what will the effects be of climate change on the success of barriers across the basin? And here we hypothesize that these climatic variables are going to be the significant drivers of the success of barriers as a control method. And where climate change is driving increasing precipitation and warming, peak flows may become higher and more frequent. And if the spawning run shifts earlier in the year, these events might overlap and we could expect to find a decrease in the effectiveness of a control. So there are many types of ecosystem modeling approaches that could be useful in this scenario, but here we're choosing to use a Bayesian belief network to look at these causal relationships between climate and hydrology and the probability of sea lamprey overcoming a control barrier. So these types of models represent the probabilistic causal relationships between variables, and they're useful for their ability to handle missing data and incorporate data of many different types and sources. So here, each relationship can be independently quantified through a range of methods and available data. And it makes it a good tool to synthesize and clearly represent what we know about the system. However, there are two weaknesses of this approach. Firstly, their inability to represent feedback loops, and that continuous data needs to be bounded into these discrete states. So here we're assuming that the causality in our model is unidirectional and that the loss of information through discretization will not actually affect the accuracy of our findings. So our basic modeling framework here is organized into a loose spatial hierarchy, representing variables that are influential at that scale and the abundance of adults at that scale. And these causal relationships can affect nodes across multiple spatial scales. So we have two general models just describing different possible causal variables and relationships. Our base model is a simplified to the most general reasonable explanation of the system, while our full model describes a more complex series of relationships involving local and network catchment landscape variables and sea lamprey physiological factors. And so the relationships in this network are governed by conditional probabilities of each state of the output node, given each combination of states of the nodes that influence it. We can start to specify what the probability of each state would be for each row, representing a different combination of parameters. We can specify these conditional probability distributions through several ways. Machine learning algorithms that can learn the most likely distribution from the data, or where we generally have a good understanding of the underlying mechanism, we can use statistical models. Or where we have little data, we can actually incorporate expert knowledge through a structured elicitation process to quantify the understanding of system experts. Or where we don't know anything about a particular combination of states, we can express complete uncertainty through a uniform probability of each state. And so to understand the relative influence of each node in our network, we employed two types of sensitivity analyses. First, a one-way sensitivity analysis to look at the relative influence of each variable, and then what's called the sensitivity to findings analysis, where we look at how perfect knowledge of each of our nodes influences the uncertainty of our outputs. And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to be showing the results of our sensitivity to findings analysis, which we use entropy reduction as a metric of uncertainty. And so looking at the results of this for our base model, we see our output variable here. And of course, if we specify complete certainty about the state of this variable, then uncertainty is going to be reduced by 100%. Next, if these variables outlined in red, we're considering our main drivers of uncertainty. And so specifying the state of these nodes results in large reductions in the uncertainty in our outputs. For example, if we know how many sea lamprey are in a stream in each month of the spawning run, that would result in a 31% reduction in the uncertainty around how many would end up passing a barrier. And if we know that and the proportion that would make it upstream to the barrier, then that adds up to a 50% reduction in uncertainty. And then lastly, we have these trace variables, which have only a small reduction in the output uncertainty, and they're therefore less important variables to focus data collection on. Now looking at our full model here, so this more complex series of relationships, we don't immediately see that the sensitivity structure is very different. And in fact, our uncertainty drivers here have approximately the same percentage of entropy reduction as our simplified set of relationships. This is showing that the overall sensitivity structure of our two models here is essentially the same, and that specifying a more complex set of relationships didn't really change which variables we should be focusing on to reduce the uncertainty. And now let's look at our base and full models and how they estimated the efficacy of a barrier across the basin using future climate projections. And so here we're going to be looking at each of the first sea lamprey blocking barriers in each stream on the US side of the basin. And so here I'm showing a map of each of these barriers animated from March until September and using modeled climate data projected from 2020 to 2040. And so here you'll see the color of each point is representing the probability of 250 adult lamprey passing above a barrier in each month, as estimated from our base model, so representing that more simplified explanation. And importantly here, we actually fixed the abundance of adults in each stream to 500 in a given month to account for the relative uncertainty we still have in our model about the timing and distribution of adult lamprey during the spawning run. So every stream here and every month is identical in terms of sea lamprey abundance within the stream. And so we can just look at how differences in climate are driving that probability of greater than half of the spawners in the stream in a given month being able to pass over an area. And what we see is not very much. With our base model, we don't actually elucidate any of these spatial differences in barrier permeability that we know are likely. But when we look at our full model here, so the more complex series of relationships, despite having a nearly identical sensitivity structure, we start to see greater spatial differences across the basin. So above this line, you'll see that the probability of significant barrier passage is much higher from March until May. So while that increased probability shifts to barriers below this line later in the season. And although we are purposely not accounting for differences in the abundance of adults in each stream during these months in this particular graph, given that the spawning runs generally peak around May, this could indicate that control barriers in areas around Lake Ontario, the northeastern lower peninsula and the eastern upper peninsula are those that are facing higher risk. So looking again at our base model, here we have the probability of each discrete state of abundance upstream of a barrier and across each lake and across each climate projection. And we're not seeing very many noticeable differences over the course of the year. If we look at just a single climate projection from 2020 to 2040 here, across all 5 lakes, we're still not seeing that differences across each lake like we saw in the animation. But if we look across all of our climate projections, we're also not seeing any variation given increased precipitation and warming streams. If we look at the same thing with our full model again, here we can see that there is some variation spatially across all 5 lakes. But if we're looking across climate projections, we're still not actually seeing any variation when it comes to increased precipitation and warming streams on the actual permeability of the ground. So where does that leave us? Firstly, when it comes to reducing uncertainty, we can say that between 6.1 and 7.3% can be reduced via certainty in how passable each individual barrier is. But that increases to a 31% reduction in the uncertainty if we know exactly what the state of the spawning migration timing will be, and up to 50% reduction in uncertainty if we know if we're certain about the timing and the migration as well as the probability of extreme movement. And so while better understanding of how sea lamprey overcome barriers is important and can affect the control outcome, in terms of prioritizing barriers, it's more important, it seems, to focus on these migration timing variables in terms of where we should focus our monitoring efforts. And secondly, when it comes to patterns in barrier passage, we can look at the permeability of a barrier and see that the eastern basin around Lake Ontario, the northeastern lower peninsula and the eastern upper peninsula might be showing a higher probability of a significant amount of barrier passage, especially from March to May, while that pattern shifts to the western basin from June onwards. And our findings show that the number of spawners in each stream in each month of the spawning run is a very important source of uncertainty, and one that we need better data on to show not only which barriers are more or less effective, but if that could result in a significant number of spawners making it upstream of the barrier. So as of right now, our plan, we plan to have our model peer reviewed to ensure that our model behavior matches what we currently understand about the system. So the next steps will be to fill in some of these gaps in our understanding of several relationships in the model, such as that sea lamprey run timing and how that might shift with warming stream temperatures, as well as better data collection of when and where sea lamprey are passing control barriers. Having that data will allow us to empirically validate the model, such as through leave one out or k-fold cross-validation, and can help ensure that we have accurately structured our model. So future research and data collection should focus on these factors that we've identified to help improve the accuracy of our predictions so we can more precisely estimate the efficacy of control barriers and help improve barrier prioritization and sea lamprey control. And thank you very much. I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Connor, for that presentation. Very good presentation. Any questions, comments from the audience? You can raise your hand or write in the chat if you have any question or comment. Thomas, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Connor. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. So I'm wondering, I may have missed this, but what were the temperature ranges and the amount of precipitation that you were varying within the model? Like what was the range that you were evaluating?
I have to go back. We were using modeled climate data, so we were using it from a series of I think it's the CMMP6 climate projection set. So I think that the precipitation values range from anywhere from 40 millimeters in a given month all the way up to close to 200. And temperature ranges, we were using air temperature and then converting it to stream temperature. So they were, temperature ranges also varied pretty widely as well through the basin.
Excellent, thank you.
Any questions, comments? John?
Yeah, great job, Connor. I had a question related to some of the data you mentioned on evidence for barrier failures in the system already. Are there any common features of barriers that seem to, not work as well out there now?
Yeah, so from literature that I've read, mostly the physical characteristics of the barrier that tend to be important are the angle of the barrier. So whether it's a actual vertical low head barrier or if it has some kind of slope to it, as well as the presence of a crest to the barrier. Those tend to be, or at least we think are relatively predictive of how easy it is for lamprey to pass. But it tends to seem that these hydrological factors are more important in allowing passage or in terms of a structural failure of the dam.
I cannot see any further questions for you, Connor. So I think great job on behalf of everybody.